That's all you are, Dinky. You're just a Baizuo. You're just a Baizuo beta male cuck and a soy boy. It should probably go without saying that this argument isn't really an argument at all. It's more of a lazy straw man of the Maoist position. This is, of course, the Baizuo argument. The crux of the Baizuo argument is that Maoists are a bunch of Western or white leftists who sit on our armchairs and criticize socialist movements outside of the West, not from a constructive or theoretically grounded point of view, and certainly not with any sophistication to our criticisms, but rather from an elitist and contrarian desire to decry socialist movements across the world for not listening to the supposed enlightened Western leftists, who think that they know better than the millions of Chinese people, Cuban people, Laotian, Korean, and Vietnamese people. There are a lot of elements to the Baizuo argument that need to be unpacked. The issue of whitesplaining and Western chauvinism, the issue of petty bourgeois intelligentsia, the issue of contrarianism and sectarianism, and the issue of liberal identity opportunism. Let's start by discussing the issues of Western chauvinism and whitesplaining. For lack of a better term, whitesplaining is when white people attempt to speak on issues primarily affecting members of non-white oppressed identities, not from an educated point of view, which takes the experiences and testimonies of non-white people into account in their statements, but rather from a point of view which is largely ignorant or miseducated on the non-white experience. In doing so, it misrepresents the views of oppressed non-white identities and glosses over nuance in their points of view in a way that reflects the ignorance and white privilege of the person doing the whitesplaining. Western chauvinism, on the other hand, is definitely related to whitesplaining, but is often more generalized to the default Western interpretation of world politics, often being steeped in liberal bourgeois interpretations of history and current events. Usually, white privilege presents itself within these analyses, but some could also say that this is a Eurocentric or America-centric worldview. In fact, it's this sort of liberal bourgeois thought, steeped in white privilege and Western chauvinism, that sums up the major flaws of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia in Western countries. Even when these intellectuals believe they're promoting revolutionary, anti-capitalist, and countercultural ideas, the sad fact is that these errors permeate across their entire analysis, seemingly without any self-awareness or self-examination. In doing so, many of these petty bourgeois white intellectuals will become overly cocky and confident, believing in their own intellectual superiority. This is a common problem with debate bros that I've discussed in the past, but this is also a general trend of contrarianism that I've observed throughout the Western left. To be a contrarian is to generally oppose what is popular or what is commonly accepted, not from a principled point of view, but to simply distinguish yourself in an edgy attempt to be different, in a pointless attempt to boost your own ego in a confident and self-congratulatory manner. In order to address and counter the Baizuo argument, we have to acknowledge that there are kernels of truth to be found here. There is a trend of contrarianism within the American communist movement. Many people call themselves communists because they want to be edgy and chase clout, not because they actually have any ideological convictions behind their beliefs. And oftentimes, this contrarianism occurs hand in hand with petty bourgeois intellectualism, steeped in Western chauvinism, white privilege, and a false sense of intellectual superiority. By a matter of principle, we must repudiate and rectify these errors when they manifest in the movement. The irony is that I often see these errors emerging from the Social Democrats, the anarchists, the revisionist Marxist-Leninists, and the Trotskyists much more than I see emerging from Maoists. This follows a general trajectory of Social Democrats and anarchists often being the trends which most commonly commit these errors, followed by the Trotskyists, but you also see a sizable portion of Marxist-Leninists doing this as well. In fact, those who use the Baizuo argument as a bludgeon against Maoist critiques of China and market socialist reforms are committing the very type of bourgeois liberal identity opportunism they accuse the radical liberals of. To say your argument is invalid because you're white is synonymous with liberal identity opportunism, which will disregard the positions of privileged identities purely on the basis of their identity rather than by dealing with their actual arguments, even if their arguments are principled and theoretically grounded. These revisionists are often the same people who cry and whine endlessly about quote-unquote woke identity politics and how it censors people if they're straight, white, and male. I've made a long video going into detail about actual wokeness and how Marxism is the most woke ideology someone can profess by its very nature, a fact that will no doubt rustle the jimmies of a lot of right opportunist hacks and revisionist bootlickers who pretend to be Marxist on the internet. I also discussed in that video the differences between proletarian identity politics versus liberal or bourgeois identity politics. This is also the problem with people who use the term Maoist, meaning white Maoist, as some kind of a dig against Maoist in the West. This raises an obvious question. Can non-white people be revisionist and commit the errors of liberal identity opportunism? Obviously, the revisionists have no problem recognizing this fact when they look at the arguments of the pseudo-woke radical liberals, but seem ironically unaware of how they do the exact same thing when they call Maoists a bunch of Baizuo Maoists. In fact, these revisionists are using Chinese, Cuban, Vietnamese, Korean, and Laotian people as an ideological shield to hide their own revisionism in a tokenizing and patronizing manner. Now, who's really the Whitesplainer, and who's really the chauvinist? Or are you going to have the arrogance to tell the comrades in Turkey, India, and the Philippines that they're all a bunch of Maoist Baizuos as well? And while they use the people of China and other quote-unquote AES countries as a shield for their revisionism, maybe they can tell the Maoist and anti-revisionist within those countries how Baizuo they are while they're at it. This also ignores an obvious fact that the majority of contributions to Maoist theory comes outside of the West, from the experiences of comrades in India, the Philippines, Turkey, Peru, and many, many more. Last I checked, most of the people in those countries aren't white. Contrary to deriving my theoretical views from debate bro, internet-addicted streamers, and LaRouche bag, sex pest cult leaders, my views come straight from the revolutionary experience of communist revolutionaries immersed in actual struggles in India, the Philippines, and elsewhere. So step up your game and do better. The Baizuo argument is just plain lazy and sad. It's a way to put me in a box and say, opinion disregarded because you're white or you're from the West. There's also another facet to this argument. The idea that Americans are somehow barred from critiquing other communist movements around the world because of the simple fact that we live in America. They tell us to stay in our lane and fix our own problems here in America before we try to tell the Chinese, the Cuban, or other peoples what to do with their movements. Maybe they've forgotten a little fact about Marxism, that it's international. The duty of Marxists, including Maoists, is to understand how the world works, analyzing historical and current events pertinent to the global working class struggle through the lens of dialectical materialism. One of the primary tasks of Maoist, as the third and highest stage of Marxism, is to analyze the state of the global class struggle, and Maoists have pointed out the fundamental revisionist errors of the revisionist countries in their adoption of market socialist reforms, and how this leads to capitalist restoration, the return of neocolonialism, and even social imperialism in the case of China. This also ignores the fact that to have a communist movement in America, it will require a struggle against revisionism. Maoists seek to repudiate mistaken tendencies in our movement, of which there are so many. The American communist movement is riddled with right opportunism, revisionism, crypto-fascism, and liberalism, as well as issues of ultra-leftism, dogmatism, and sectarianism. And Maoists who are serious about building a communist movement in America have to call out these errors in our movement, both domestically and internationally. Or do you somehow think that the revisionist situation in China is only the business of the Chinese people? That it somehow doesn't affect the movements in Nepal, India, and the Philippines, or even the movements in other quote-unquote AES countries, maybe even the movement in America as well? How many American Communist parties pay lip service to the revisionist AES countries and claim to support socialism while cheering for neoliberal policies like market socialism, which actually destroy the socialist project? At least Maoists, Western or otherwise, have a spine to actually defend socialism. If you want to know what actually existing socialism looks like, look to Stalin's USSR after the end of the new economic policy and before Khrushchev's reforms. And look to Mao's China after the new democratic period. Maybe take the time to self-criticize and realize that your position comes from a position of revisionist campism and aesthetic support of socialism that is actually cheering for the dismantling of socialism in the quote-unquote AES countries you claim to support. So by all means, continue to look stupid by calling us Baizuos and Maoists. It's a form of non-argument that reveals your own ignorance. So, that about does it for this episode. Stay tuned for the next episode where we talk about the argument that Maoists apparently ignore the material circumstances. So be sure to let me know what you think in the comments down below. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Denki King out.